Good morning and welcome. Today we gather in celebration of the founding of our nation. Nearly 250 years ago, we provided the world with a novel conception, putting into practice an idea from the Age of Enlightenment. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Later, during the severest test that our nation has ever endured, President Lincoln encouraged us to save or meanly lose our last best hope of earth, our democratic union. From our inception, we have had differences in opinion and outright dissension. John Adams described the American Revolution as an attempt to get 13 clocks to strike at the same second. Despite these differences, we have striven to create a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Throughout our history, the art of compromise has moved us forward. After free dialogue and careful listening to diverse opinions, we've been able to identify the common ground, and this has allowed our country to progress. In my opinion, the last 60 to 70 years have significantly tested that progress, culminating in the painful sight of razor wire encircling our capital. In the early 1800s, when Thomas Jefferson, the author of our Declaration of Independence, perceived the Union to be threatened, he wrote, "It awakened me like a fire bell in the night." Thank you. You couldn't hear me? Do you want me to start again? I don't either. Good. He wrote, "It awakened me like a fire bell in the night and filled me with terror." This morning, we hope to heed that sense of alarm and have a fruitful discussion regarding the threats posed to our democracy and to seek our best efforts to maintain and strengthen it. Our democracy requires us as citizens to actively endeavor to uphold it. Though recent events press upon our minds, our discussion is intended to be much broader in scope. Our panelists today include Susan Glasser, New Yorker magazine columnist, David Gregory, political analyst for CNN, and Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. I apologize for my lack of experience with this mic, or any mic for that matter. For approximately an hour, we will explore various topics related to these issues. Then we will entertain questions from the audience. To allow your participation, we have provided pens and cards to the ushers. Should you wish to pose a question, please signal an usher. The ushers will collect your questions approximately 30 minutes into our program. Let us begin. Recently, we have experienced significant, even historic events, and we tend to ascribe undue weight to the current actors. This in no way should mean that we should not hold these actors accountable. However, we also need to understand that the forces and changes in our society have set the stage for these events. The very origin of the word civility derives from the Latin word for citizen and implies the need for mutual respect. This norm of political discourse has substantially declined over the last 70 years. How important is the norm of civility to our democracy, our society at large, politically, in media? Susan, do you mind starting?
Well, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? All right. Well, first of all, thank everyone here. I have to say, it's a gorgeous day, and I'm shocked that you're not out at the beach already, but thank you for that. And in a way, I hope this will make me more optimistic than I might be otherwise, just because so many people would come out to think about democracy on a day like this, when I do believe that it is under threat in a way that would have been literally unthinkable, not only earlier in our lifetime, but even as recently as a couple years ago. I think it was very hard to see with clarity that the nature of the challenges in front of us. And I am a believer that unless you have a clear-eyed assessment of the problem, of the threat, you're certainly not going to move towards solutions. And I agree with the premise of the question that civility, the erosion of it, and essentially the disappearance of a common public space in our democracy is a core sign, certainly, of the lights blinking red in our democracy. And we were joking backstage, but I would actually go further and say that civility itself is controversial now in Washington, in our politics, in a way that actually makes some sense, right? At a time of increasing disagreement, also where the stakes have escalated. Do you want to be polite? And the rationale that you'll hear, of course, from extreme partisans is, why should I be polite to somebody who doesn't believe I have rights? Why should I, what is the value of politeness when, 6 unelected justices are, taking away rights from millions and millions of American women, for example? And so it's not as easy as falling back even on, the sort of comfortable old nostrums, right? Like the idea when I was a kid coming to Nantucket, and I'll stop, in the summer, that you would have to go to a panel discussion on, the current perilous state of democracy was unthinkable, right? Today is a day for cliches. It is a day for, politicians of right and left to say the same things that they said, that their grandparents said. It is a day to get the Boston Globe and maybe somebody reads the Declaration of Independence, which they print every year as the editorial. It's not a day to worry about the present and the future. And I think the very fact that we're here worrying about it, is pretty telling, unfortunately.
Well, I would add to that, but just is also, I would just say happy 4th. And I love America. I mean, we have a lot of problems, but we're still a great country that is willing to wrestle with where we fail, where we come short. And we also recognize in this country that democracy is worth continuing to strive to perfect, to get right in this country. There are other countries around the world whose leaders certainly do not think democracy is worth it. Do not think capitalism is a worthy enterprise. And so we have a lot of these strains in this country, and I think your question about civility and Susan's point about the controversial nature of civility, it speaks to the fact that we do have a robust public space. It's just really toxic right now. People are always calling, and and we're filled with distractions and all kinds of voices that undermine something which I think of on this topic is fidelity to the idea of something that is the common good, that we all have some stake in. One of the things I love about Nantucket is that it is a community, whether you come during the summer, whether you're here year round, whether you've been coming as my wife has since she was a little girl. It matters what happens here. And we have a great clean team, that cleans the beaches. We need a little bit more of that in our democracy as well, that people say, hey, we got to get involved. We got to keep up our democracy. We got to think about what goes on in our media and our public space, and in our discourse, because the permission to be uncivil means that there's no accountability. So it's not just, Donald Trump didn't come out of nowhere. There's other politicians who have developed this. And let's also not forget that we've had periods in our history that would make us blanch even today. I mean, we haven't had somebody beaten on the floor of and we've had an insurrection, obviously, but so these kinds of things have happened in the past as well, where we've had periods of gross incivility, and real strains and real questions about whether we were going to make it.
Yeah, one of the ones that comes to mind for me is, and I'm older than all of you, I guess, is Senator Joe McCarthy. And I want to read a quote from Margaret Chase Smith, who said, "Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it's not even exercised by others." Peter?
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant quote to bring up today, and I want to share Susan and David's good wishes to everybody and astonishment that you're here. I love that it's such a Nantucket way to do a conversation, by the way. Wicker couches with a beautiful carpet here on a living room style thing. We've done a lot of panels. I don't think we've ever had anything quite as cool as this. So thank you guys for having us today. It's interesting. Speaking of history, I've been reading Watergate books the last couple of weeks just because of the 50th anniversary and looking for context, right? And David's point, I think, is right. I mean, look, we had a civil war in this country. We had beatings on the floor of the Senate. We've had McCarthyism. We've had rough moments. Certainly, it's part of our history. But I was reading about Watergate, and I was struck by the reporting of the moment when you had Mike Mansfield, who was the Senate Democratic leader, and Hugh Scott, who was the Senate Republican leader, meeting and discussing what to do and how to get through this tumultuous period and this period of great trauma for the country, and what to do when Nixon ultimately stepped down, because they knew he ultimately would, and how to make it easier for Gerald Ford to come in and to heal the country. And there was this sense of shared purpose that the two of them and other Democrats and Republicans in these books that I'm reading had about the broad. They were partisans. They, favor one side or the other. They wanted to win elections. They were awfully tough with each other at times. It's not that this is, politics ain't beanbag, and it never has been in America. But there was this sense in moments of crisis of a shared purpose. We are all Americans, that civility you talk about. And I think Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy haven't spoken probably in years. I mean, certainly not in a consequential way. And at the end of Trump, right? How long did Trump go without speaking with Nancy Pelosi? More than a year.
A year and a half.
1 year and a half. And Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, by the way, weren't speaking either. Yeah. So it's not entirely just along party lines. There is a chasm in Washington right now that it reflects the chasm in our broader country, in which we do not speak with each other. And we are increasingly segregating ourselves along political lines, even as well as other lines. We live together with people who agree with us, and we don't want to live with people who don't agree with us. That's both physical, right? The dividing point right now is 700 people per square mile. If you live in a place with more than 700 people per square, Nantucket may be an exception, more than 700 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat. If you live in a place with less dense, under 700 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Republican. We do that metaphorically in the sense of our social media, in the sense of our traditional media, what we read, who we watch on television. We want to be with people who agree with us. We don't want to even have a conversation at times, it seems like, with people who don't agree with us. And when we do have those conversations, they are unfortunately increasingly angry and hostile, and they are hard to overcome the sense of distrust, the sense of disrespect that both sides have for each other. And yes, I use those terrible words, both sides, which get me in trouble from people. Fine, there is, I'm not saying both sides are always equal or equally evil, but there is a broader issue here that we are having a hard time talking with each other.
You know, there's a politics of spite now. It's not just power, which has always been a key element of it, but it's a politics of spite. And to underline a couple of things that you're saying, Peter, there's a sense that we're judging each other not so much based on what we believe, but who we think we are, or who I think you are, or who you think I am. We have to say that we have a media ecosystem that has evolved by way of creating a financial model around the creation of community. It is not about edifying the public. It is about creating community. That's where the money is. That's where the friction is. That's where the division is. That is the financial model, and it fits because we increasingly want to organize ourselves around people who think like us and agree with us. And now the media ecosystem, which is much broader than organizations we represent, are making that easier for all of us than ever before. And that's what changes politics, in my view, ultimately, because then the accountability becomes much different. I mean, you talk about the McCarthy era. So Richard Nixon is certainly culpable in that era of using the McCarthy playbook to go after communists with the tacit permission of Eisenhower, who didn't really want to get his hands dirty, but Nixon does that. Nixon's a bad dude. He goes on, he leaks information about secret peace talks with Vietnam and then uses it for the purposes of his reelection. He then commits impeachable offense. But what does he do at the end of the day? This man of the establishment, he turns over the most incriminating evidence against him. I don't think our most recent president would have done that. That's an observation that Bob Woodward made to really mark the contrast. It speaks to your point about civility. It speaks to your point about the impact of McCarthyism.
It also speaks, though, to, I think, where we're headed in terms of it's not just grand structural issues. And that's one thing that I think it's hard to reckon with, the role of the individual, both in terms of accountability or lack thereof, but also, it was not foreordained that we would be exactly in this moment. And I do think that's very important. There are a broad structural changes in our politics, absolutely. If you look at, one indicator I often look at is back in the 1980s, certainly a partisan time, right? Ronald Reagan wasn't exactly an uncontroversial figure, right? And yet at the same time, our politics was structurally so different. You had a large percentage of the US Senate, those senators came from states that voted in a different direction for president, right? So there was ticket splitting, there was the goal of getting to 51%. Back in when Jerry Ford ran for election in 1976 in his own right, something like half the states were genuinely competitive at one point or in the other. And in the general election, I think, that number was maybe, it was about 24, 25 states. In recent cycles, it's been something like 10 states only that were actually competitive in any meaningful way. So I'm not discounting structural changes, but what I want to say is that would the United States be in a different and potentially much less perilous state in terms of at least its politics right now had someone other than Donald Trump been president? The answer is almost certainly yes. And I mean a different Republican, never mind a Democrat. So I don't think it's purely partisan. Individuals matter. Anyone I've ever, spent some time with who worked in the White House, one of their big takeaways, what's it like to actually work in the White House? And they will all come away and say, the one thing that academic literature consistently understates is actually the incredible power and the role of individuals in making those decisions. And, for good and for ill, by the way, you bring all the limits that you have, as a person and, in terms of your knowledge, your background to those positions. But it does make a difference. The place where we are today was dictated in many ways because of the very unlikely events of 2015 and 2016.
A couple numbers to back up what Susan's saying. She mentioned ticket splitting. Ticket splitting is a great way to measure our calcification in politics, our polarization, right? We're dividing ourselves into these states. In 1986, during Reagan's presidency, 59% of the Senate races, 59% went in a different direction than the vote for president in the previous 2 years. In other words, states were willing to pick a Democratic senator, even as they voted for a Republican president or vice versa, right? 59%. You know what the number was in 2020? It was 34 out of 35 Senate races went the same direction as the presidential race. We are locking ourselves in to a much more calcified politics. And look at the poll numbers. Trump is a great example, but it didn't start with Trump. But Trump, in the last 5 years, and now Biden, has been governing in an environment where we are 40-40, and it gets up to 42, down to 39. Like Trump's approval ratings never topped 50%. They stayed in this very narrow range between 38 to say 45% the entire 4 years he was in office. It is still in that same range today, despite everything that happened. Events have not changed people's views of Trump. They believe they like him or don't like him, not depending on what happened, but they went in where they were in 2016. They have not changed their minds. And basically that's true for Biden now too. His numbers are not movable. He got over 51% because people didn't like Trump, but as soon as he got in office, he went down to the same, a little bit higher than Trump, 40 to 45, 46% is his range, and it's immovable for a year and a half. It's basically gone in that small range. We used to go up and down a whole lot more. When JFK bungled the Bay of Pigs, his numbers went up to 82%. He says, if I keep failing like this, I'm gonna really do well. I mean, like, we are not reacting to events, we are reacting to who we believe in. We are in camps, and we're sticking to our camps.
But I can I just add, I think that I'm really interested in all of this, and I think what it misses a little bit is still a sense of a larger narrative. So if we're asking about are our politics messy and calcified and we're divided, yes, but we're trying to go a little bit deeper and say, is there something fundamentally cracked or broken with our democracy? The idea that we are representative of the people, that there's enough access to votes and to voting, and that individual rights are protected. To me, there's a larger narrative about where democratic government in America starts to wither, starts to undergo these stress tests. And I do think in our recent history, we had the 9/11 attacks, and we had what we can say now was an overreach in that response to those attacks. This country suffered something of a nervous breakdown, which you could not say out loud for at least a decade, and yet the results history has taught us that that's true. And there I think were real changes in attitudes about America's response to 9/11, that the projection of American power abroad, it changed the Republican Party. It changed how much faith Americans had in our government, in its competence. And I think we face, Susan, the idea that Trump is culpable for authoritarian actions in office, I think is without dispute. But there's also the fact that he's symptomatic and not causal in that respect. And I think the faith piece of this, that people look up and say, I don't believe that democracy is working for me. My rights don't feel protected. I can't vote as easily. I don't think America knows what it's doing. Government knows what it's doing. I think these are important questions.
I totally agree. And one of the truly pernicious effects of this toxic partisanship is I think it has really incapacitated Congress. And in that power gap, it greatly empowers the executive or the courts. And I think we're seeing the results of that. And that is, I really think, a total breeding ground for autocracy. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's the right way maybe to frame this. It's not either or. And the Congress, by the way, the erosion of Congress is something that arguably both predated Trump and is the prerequisite for the dysfunction that we're seeing right now. And if you go back and look in this post 9/11 period, you see things like, again, the sort of dashboard of democracy is blinking red. And what you see is a sharp decline in the numbers of even pieces of legislation that Congress is able to produce. You see the increase enabled in some ways by technology, in some ways by just the shifts in our media and our politics. You see the sharp increase in much more effective partisan gerrymandering. Gerrymandering goes all the way back. It's just more effective now, and that's a technology-driven development. You see a fundamental shift in who is elected to Congress and how they feel themselves, who are they responsive to, who do they react to. And so that was a prerequisite, a breeding ground for autocracy. Same thing with the erosion of faith in institutions. I think it's important to put an international context on this as well. I woke up this morning thinking about, Freedom House's indicators. Every year it studies the level of freedom around the world. For, I believe it's 16, possibly 17 straight years, the number of democracies in the world has been going down. And not only has it been going down overall, but within democracies, such as the United States, such as Hungary, you have the indicators going down as well. And that is something that really is a trend that began basically around 2000. So it's coexistent, but not driven by 9/11. And it is certainly something that's happening outside of the United States. And we are a very still inward-looking nation, and I think it's important to understand that we exist in a broader context. But the thing is that I don't think that absolves individual actors of their own responsibility, because there's a big difference between somebody who wishes to move away from those trends and somebody whose entire rationale for being in politics is to find the fault lines, to exacerbate them, to use those to gain power. And that's where the playbook of autocracy, this is what I think people should be most concerned about, because if you go down the checklist, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this book, How Democracies Die, which came out by a couple of Harvard professors in 2018. And actually, Joe Biden has said that that's one of the reasons that he chose to run for president. He has actually, from the very beginning, framed it as an authoritarian moment in American politics that is something unlike any other. And that's what I would say. Look, as we try to not be hyperventilating, right? As journalists, our job is to observe, to understand. It's not to get too worked up about any individual thing. McCarthyism is a great example. You can look at the divisions of the 19th century in the United States, say we had a civil war before, look at the violations of civil liberties in World War I. I mean, you can go on and on. What's different? I don't believe we've ever had a president of the United States enabled and having captured a political party who is not fundamentally committed to the basic principles of our constitutional democracy. So that is what's different. You talk about Richard Nixon. That's the difference.
If I can also think about how democracies die, one of the ways autocracy grows is because you disable your opponents. And I feel thrilled to have all of you here. But fake news, the disabling of something that's so fundamental to our culture, the Zenger case, 40 years before the American Revolution, an American jury stood up to the British authorities and said, basically, the press is the fair watchdog of government. I would add to that, to me, the removal of the fairness doctrine in the 1980s really changed media reporting. And I'd love to hear from all of you about either of those aspects.
Let me start by saying something Susan said I think is really important about what was happening in particularly in Eastern Europe, where you had the power of the executive branch, however those countries are structured, along with the empowerment of social media. These are more authoritarian leaders using media platforms, not to be confused with journalism, the way often they were designed to be used and abused, which is with no real governors on them in a way that can become arms of propaganda. And there's no question that Trump used social media in the way that FDR used the radio. he mastered it. He was able to go beyond media. He was able to eliminate the filter. But 2 points about that. First of all, this is an incredibly robust time for great journalism. There's a lot of great journalism out there. There's a lot of things we know that we wouldn't otherwise know because of terrific reporting, investigative reporting that is heavily invested in. But we have to do a good job as consumers understanding where everybody's coming from. And you have to understand that cable news is not on the level. You can watch it all day long. You may actually lose more information than you gain. I'm being a little facetious, but there are times when it's argument, it's not edification, and we have to be the ones to figure that out. I teach a course on the way the news landscape is changing. Thankfully, they've both joined me to speak to my students. And I tell my students, it's your job to scrutinize the information that is coming at you, to weigh it, to test it, to understand where people are coming from. And one note about Trump and media, nobody loves media more than this guy. Nobody. This whole fake news thing was all a crock. He lived and died by the oxygen that media provided. This guy called Maggie Haberman of the New York Times on her cell phone, and she called him on his cell phone. That doesn't normally happen. Peter won't comment on that, but I'm just telling you, I know this to be true. And it's extraordinary because he cared so much about what the New York Times wrote about him while still playing this very dangerous game of persuading a large segment of society to ignore the reporting about him, which is an authoritarian tactic and strategy, and did a lot to cause us to be blinking red.
Just before, I'm going to ask the ushers to circulate and collect any questions that the audience might have at this point.
Thank you. Look, David and I met covering George W. Bush, and David had a famously, what's the right word you would use? Robust relationship with Bush when they had press conferences and so on. It was actually sometimes felt pretty contentious, right? But actually, because every president at some point or another hates the press, hates the coverage they get, resents us, whatever. I actually think George W. Bush liked David and enjoyed the back and forth, even though David would give him a lot of grief. I think that was true with me. I remember one time I asked George W. Bush a question at a press conference, and he gave a snappish answer. It's fine, whatever, that happens. Afterwards, he had his communications director, a woman named Nicole Wallace, by the way, call me up and say he's really sorry. He didn't really mean to be so mean to you. He felt bad about it. I'm like, I didn't feel bad, but that's fine. That's totally fine. It's okay for him to give a tough answer if he wanted to. My point is only that all presidents, of course, have a scratchy relationship with the press. It's built into the system. It should be there. Trump is not like that. That is completely different. He does have a love-hate relationship, especially with the New York Times, but with the media in general. He cannot kick us. Susan and I are writing a book, just finished a book on him. He had us down in Mar-a-Lago to talk with him twice. Does he think this book is going to be pro-Trump? No, he doesn't. But he can't help himself, and he will trash the book when it comes out because it's not a pro-Trump book. But he can't knock himself off of it. But what he did was so pernicious and so insidious that it is different than the 44 other presidents who came before him. The notion of fake news, and particularly this idea of enemies of the people, evokes the worst of the Soviet eras, of every other dictatorship around the world. It's not that I disagree with this paper. I think it did the wrong thing. I think the story is wrong. They're being not fair to me. There's no credibility at all. You don't have standing in our society. Don't trust them, trust me. What he was trying to do was discredit anybody else's information than his own. He told Leslie Stahl this once. She asked him, why are you doing this so much with the media? He said off camera, he says, well, because I know if I attack you guys now, when you come up with something that I don't like, you'll be discredited. You will not be able to, nobody will believe the negative things you write about me or say about me on TV. And that was a deliberate strategy on his part to discredit the media as a very idea of a media.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, is that it is literally action item number one in the dictator's playbook, okay? That is, Peter and I were foreign correspondents in Moscow at the very beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure in 2000, 2001. What is the very first thing that Vladimir Putin did? His goal was to restore centralized authority in Russia after a decade of very faltering, but nonetheless actual small d democracy. The very first thing he did was to take over NTV, the first and only independent national television network in Russia's history. Why did he do that? Why did Erdogan in Turkey have the exact same goal? The goal is to shut down possible sources of potential opposition to you in the future. It is action item number one in the dictator's playbook. And it is also, I think, the dehumanizing language that Peter pointed out, the enemies of the people. In Russian, actually, it's called vrag naroda, and it was actually the sentence that was used to send millions of people to the gulag. They were determined to be enemies of the people, unhuman, dehumanizing. We see this in the war right now that Russia has launched on Ukraine. It's not enough to say that there are competing national interests, perhaps, or that there are clashes over borders, or even potentially over ideology. If you notice, the Kremlin's propaganda is that Ukrainians are non-people. And that's why I think it's so significant. And again, we've never had a president of the United States. All presidents go after the press. That is the nature of the adversarial give and take between different groups that have different roles in our society. But to me, this represents something, really different. And, but again, I keep coming back to, especially on this holiday, for a democracy to work, the individuals within it have to, play their assigned roles. And if they don't, it doesn't work. No matter, we pat ourselves on the back about institutions. Institutions are made up of individuals. And, Donald Trump, every society has, people like this, right? Without millions and millions of supporters and enablers, he's an old dude shouting at the TV. I mean, let's be real, right? Like that's...
Well, and which is why I think it's important to say 70 million people voted for him. There is something that, I think we want to be careful to not just, this is a phrase my wife uses that I like, which is just admire the problem. We also have to point out where democracy pushes back. The empire strikes back. And in this case, democracy pushes back and says, not so fast. Because, yeah, you're right. I mean, Stalin, even during the siege of Leningrad, is sending journalists, writers, poets, sending them to Siberia, mostly to cover up for the fact that he didn't prepare for the invasion and didn't believe it was going to happen. That has not happened in America. Let's remember that when this president affirmatively tried to steal the election, the establishment, the courts, including his appointed judges and justices to the Supreme Court, did not act on any of the purported evidence in over 60 cases meant to try to show widespread corruption. The courts, the judiciary did its job. People obviously will disagree with the Supreme Court on other issues, but Supreme Court justices appointed by Trump didn't do as what he was demanding that they do. How about the January 6th hearing? Who is it featuring? Trump loyalists, people who you didn't know, who are stepping forward publicly and saying this was wrong, firing their lawyers who were pro-Trump and doing something more independent. So there are instances where the center holds in ways that I think is worthy of us celebrating on July 4th, even as we're looking at the flashing red light saying that's not enough, because individual activism, which I think is also really at the core of this, which is one of the problems I see in journalism and in politics is the nationalization of our life. We've moved too far away from what's local activism, local participation. That matters. It has mattered, as your paper just detailed last weekend, and I thought in a really compelling way, on the issue of abortion and the work that was done at the state level among activists that really moved that forward in a direction, that ultimately got it overturned, Roe v. Wade overturned. So whether you're for it or against it, that kind of local activism, democracy in motion matters.
I want to get back to the notion of enemies. And certainly, although not to any degree like Trump, Nixon certainly had that concept. I think many of us remember Daniel Schorr reading the enemies list and going, oh my goodness, I'm on here. But we've come in our partisanship to a position where those who disagree, those who are our opponents, are our enemies and they're evil. And I fear and anger, my wife's a gardener, so I will say, create the potting soil of autocracy and hate. And beyond Trump, so many other politicians are using that to foster demagoguery. I mean, we could probably reel off 6 members of the House who are doing that. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on how we combat that as well as deal with it.
I mean, to your point on Nixon, I mean, he had an enemies list. He definitely spoke quite viscerally about the press as an enemy, but he had the good sense not to do it publicly. In other words, at that time, it was not seen as appropriate to use. I mean, like, he might have agreed with Trump on some of the language, but he wouldn't use it publicly because that was seen as out of bounds.
Right.
And
but
when the enemies list came out,
the president has become a public bully and given permission to all of us to be a bully.
And that, I agree with that. And then that enemies list was an embarrassment to him, was a scandal to him when it came out, as opposed to being something he overtly put out there, which was what we saw in the last few years. And you're right. I mean, people are rewarded for that. You know, we wrote a book, Susan and I wrote a book about James Baker, who was the Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush and the White House Chief of Staff under Reagan and under Bush. And it was, you know, again, don't romanticize the past. It was tough politics, very partisan at times. He was the campaign chairman in the 1988 election when we had the Willie Horton stuff, right? I mean, that was hardly a nice, soft election. But when it was over, literally a month after that election, Baker, newly designated as the incoming Secretary of State, is having dinner at the apartment in the Watergate of Robert Strauss, the Democratic chairman, with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, to talk about what they can do, talk about how they can end the Contra War, which had been so debilitating for the country for the last 8 years, and which you couldn't do that today. Mm-hmm. If Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi were caught having dinner, which they would never want to do because they don't like each other, both sides of their partisan divide would say they have betrayed us. It would be, compromise used to be rewarded in Washington, even if it was fake, right? You would get together with somebody on the other side of the aisle, you'd hold your hands up and say, we've got a bill, it's going to do great things for the country, and there would be perceived to be a reward politically, even again if it was not real. Today, if you did that, you would be punished. You would be punished. And we have partly because of gerrymandering, partly because of the stacking of the states where people live today, partly because they don't live in Washington, they don't know each other. But broadly speaking, people perceive in Congress, they perceive it to be dangerous, not only to work with their side, but even to be seen with the other side.
Well, I think the other point that's important to make is that it's about political incentives, but in terms of Washington, there's also been a decades-long, I really appreciated, Peter, that you framed this as something having taken place really over the last, 5, 6, even 7 decades. It's not a short-term phenomenon because in reality, there's been a long-term campaign, against the very idea of government as a productive force in the country. And that has also structurally changed our politics, and that makes it very unique to the United States. Like, I'm always looking for, where is the U.S. an outlier? We talk about the international stuff, or we talk about in our own history. Well, Trump clearly is an outlier, but other things are outliers as well. Our response to the pandemic, I think, is another good example of the phenomena that we're talking about here, because certainly you can say that many Western industrialized democracies have the problems of fragmented media, social media, political polarization that we're talking about here. Well, guess what? We were really an outlier when it came to our politicization of public health measures and our response to the pandemic. We underperformed very significantly as a result of our political dysfunction. So that's, again, I think, a marker to me of where we're even underperforming the broad set of trends, that our colleagues in places like Britain and even Hungary and Poland are living with similar phenomena. And I just, I know it can be relentlessly negative. I think, one of the things that the last few years of sort of crisis, going to crisis has taught me is that it is more important than ever to try to have an accurate read on what it is. And I think, David, you and I are having maybe a little bit of a dialogue back and forth. Is the cup half full or is it half empty to say that we survived January 6th? To say that there are people coming forward, even if there's not that kind of accountability that comes with hauling away the former president in an orange jumpsuit. There is accountability that is occurring. There is, for the historical record, a serious investigation being undertaken, our system held in certain fundamental ways. So you can look at it that way, and I don't disagree with any of those. But you can also look at it and say, does anyone think that next time it would go the same way? That we would be so lucky. And I think that's one of the things that caused Peter and I to want to write this history of Trump in the White House, was not only to document it, but also a sense that this was, as the generals say, a very near-run thing. It was a much closer call for democracy. And the former president and those around him, they learned the vulnerabilities in our system. They probed, they tested. You look at the story over time. Peter talked about Jim Baker and the White House Chief of Staff. You could tell the story of the last presidency in the story of those four different chiefs of staff. And Mark Meadows was probably a key reason why January 6th occurred versus someone like John Kelly, the former Marine general, who probably ended up, as we write in the book, hating the President of the United States more than any White House Chief of Staff has ever.
But I agree. We're not so much having a disagreement, but maybe we're approaching it from slightly different ways. And I agree with you in that one of the big areas to focus on here is, what is the solution and what's going to bring about solutions. The reality is that we learn a lot from periods of time. I mean, we were talking about the excess of executive power. Well, what did LBJ teach us about the excess of executive power and the idea of not consulting Congress on a war resolution after what he did in Vietnam? Or we talk about the absence of debate before projection of U.S. power overseas. We learn from the response to 9/11. So Trump does lose re-election. Does he run again? Does he win again? What will that teach us about what the structural failings are? I mean, so I'm with you that the blinking red piece is, how are we going to address some of these things? We have a big role to play in the media, understanding that on the one hand, we are providing good documentation and good evidence. Are people listening? Are they acting on it? Are we at least taking stock that why was it so easy for somebody in 2016 to come in and say the news media is the enemy of the people? And lots of people said, yeah, right on, they are. Why was it so easy to do? We have to take stock of that. So we can't just be so concerned about the loss of, Jim Baker is gone. That era is gone. I don't see that coming back. But we do have to, there's a little bit of, we're all responsible here. And every one of us here in our interactions today with other people we agree with or don't agree, do you see other people who you disagree with? Let's talk about Liz Cheney for a minute. How many people in this, oh, right, no, that's my point. That's my point. Do you remember when, if we were here in 2004, if I said Liz Cheney is a war criminal and believes in torture and is pro-war, I would have gotten those same applause. So let's not forget,
Totally right.
let's not forget that we live in a cancel culture that didn't start 2 days ago. That that Liz Cheney had been canceled by a lot of the same people who now consider her a heroine. We have to take stock of that if we want to make changes in democracy. See other people, hear them, see where they're coming from. You don't have to agree, but if we don't do that structural work as citizens, then we're not going to make a lot of headway toward getting back to a more robust middle in this country that can stand up to the extremists.
Total agreement.
I just said all that to get a little applause, that's all.
I just want to take a moment to kind of reemphasize something Susan brought up. As staggering as January 6th was, our failure to find common ground to combat a pandemic that has taken over 1 million American lives is, I think, a product of this pernicious partisanship and inability to focus on common ground. Yeah. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. I'm going to switch now to taking some questions from the audience. I didn't do this. I'm going to switch to take questions from the audience. We're going to have to end right at 11:30, so we have about a half an hour left. Question number one. We're being governed, it seems, to a great extent by a reactionary minority. How do we get back to majority rule?
Well, it's a good question because, in fact, you can make the case of the structure of the government that we are living in, with that our framers helped us. We're heading toward 246 years ago, has brought home that we're not a democracy in the purest sense of the word. We are a republic, right? We have an electoral college. We don't vote directly for president. Why should Wyoming get 3 electoral votes, when, a more popular? So all these things are all true. So you have a Senate that is not necessarily representative of the population at large. You have a presidency that is not representative necessarily presidency at large. We've now had twice in the last 20 years, or really within 16 years, a president elected who didn't actually win the popular vote. It's rather striking if you think about it. It's really amazing. It only happened, it hadn't happened in more than a century before that. Now we've had it twice in 16 years. One election makes a difference. 2016. If 2016 goes the other direction, you have a 6-3 liberal court instead of a 6-3 conservative court. It's as simple as that, right? And was the 2016 election representative of the country? No, it wasn't. But that's the system that we have built. So you have to fight within the system we have built, or fight to change the system. If you want to get rid of the electoral college, get rid of the electoral college. You want to change the Senate and make it more representative, change the Senate. But the system we have is what it is right now. And therefore, you're right. We have a situation where you can have a Supreme Court which will overturn Roe v. Wade, even though that's not the view of the majority. Now, it's not the court's job to reflect the view of the majority necessarily. Remember, of course, when the argument that conservatives would make is when they court passed Brown, ruled Brown versus Board of Ed, that was certainly against the majority will. So majority will shouldn't necessarily be the be-all and end-all for a court. But in terms of the selection of justices, which has become so huge to ideology in particularly the last 15, 20 years, we see a systematic effort to put people on the court whose ideologies are in keeping with the presidents who are elected, and the presidents may not be elected through majority support. And that's obviously a big issue in this country right now. Again, it's the system we have. So you either have to change the system or you have to find a way to work within it.
I just want to make a comment about going back to Congress as well, right? Does Congress do its job? I think one of the mistakes tactically that the Biden administration made is they thought there was a different moment than there was coming off this election, which was basically return America to normal. They said, no, this is a new FDR-like moment. FDR doesn't have that moment for the New Deal, if not for the Depression, and a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, as Warren Buffett says. And Congress does act, whether it was the financial collapse, whether it was the attack on Pearl Harbor, which wiped away the isolationist movement, or whether it was 9/11. That tends to usher in huge accomplishment on the part of Congress because of fear and because of crisis. So when people assume it's like the tyranny of the minority, some of it is that that the power in Congress is not always what people think it is. A lot of liberals are really mad at Joe Manchin. Well, there's a reason why Joe Manchin is the senator from West Virginia. If he voted for all these things, he may not be the senator from West Virginia, and then you get a Republican for sure, and then you won't even have a chance to change the filibuster rules, which, by the way, could come back to hurt the Democrats too, if it's a simple majority. Americans like gridlock in a lot of ways. And I think there is a reaction to government doing a lot. When government acts boldly, when government spends a ton of money, when government intervenes strongly in the economy, we have seen over history there tends to be a time of recoiling, where Americans would like government to tone it down a bit.
No.
No.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think that in the back and forth between branches, we tend, again, to be very inward looking. What concerns me is the power of a concentrated, effective minority to achieve, whether it's a takeover of government, whether it is an authoritarian takeover. Americans often have a very almost gauzy and unrealistic notion about how government should work or what our democracy is. And if you look at the sort of great excesses in the 20th century, those were perpetrated at first by dedicated minorities of people who used the tools of democracy to destroy and dismantle democracy itself. And it was never, you don't need 51% or 55% to destroy a democracy. A very dedicated, disciplined 1/3 or 40% is more than enough to destroy democracy. And you can look at any example from the terrible history of the 20th century and see that that's exactly how it took place. And elections often facilitated the destruction of democracy. And in fact, that's something that we see today. Peter and I saw it firsthand in Russia. And I think we see the consequences now writ large over time of ignoring that. And, one of the insights that for me has stood out in the last few years in looking at the ebb and flow of power between the branches and among the branches of the US government, right? The courts, Congress, and the executive. In that ebb and flow, I think the toxicity of partisanship was something that didn't seem to be fully accounted for. Remember that the Constitution and this system of government came about at a time before there were well-established political parties in the United States, and at a time when everyone from George Washington on feared the notion, was very wary of the idea of institutionalizing factions and political parties. And so it was a government envisioned without that in mind. And what we've seen is that Congress, in many ways, has abdicated again and again because partisanship actually has become more important than institutional affiliation. And for me, that's been one of the big, worrisome developments, is understanding in the last few years that Congress is not acting in the way that it's supposed to act as a guarantor of democracy and of the people's votes, being closer to the people in many ways than the executive. Well, but they're not closer to the people if party rather than institutional loyalty comes first. And I think that's a big shift that we're seeing in our lifetimes.
Absolutely agree. It makes me think back to the notion, reading a majority, if not all of the founders, they felt that Republican virtue was a prerequisite for democracy to work. Now, granted, we're 250 years away from that, great societal changes, but I think that's something to reflect upon about, and gets into questions of loyalty. Is your loyalty to a person, your hometown, your state, your political party, the Constitution, or our country as a whole? Did you want to add anything on this topic, Peter?
No, I agree.
Okay, another question. Based on your knowledge of other democratic democracies across the globe who have fallen to authoritarianism or oligarchic systems, in your opinion, how close is America to losing its true democracy, and what can be done to get it back? I think we've answered some parts of that, but I'll go with the internationalists here.
Look, I mean, there's the broad view and then there's the immediate view, right? The broad view is, if you're looking at this day, 246 years later, there's a very positive story still to be told. The people who gathered 246 years ago to declare independence did not create a democracy that we would recognize today. It was a democracy for the privileged, white, male landowners only, straight. It did not include women, did not include African Americans, obviously. It did not include white men who didn't have means. So the progress we have made from 246 years ago to today is really quite striking, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. We should feel good about that. The fact that we're arguing about issues like racism and sexism and homophobia and transgender rights is at least a function of our healthy belief in making progress forward, in creating a union of all people and a society where we all believe that. That's the long-term thing. The short-term thing is I think we're in a pretty perilous moment. Because I do think that one vice president, one attorney general, one judge, a handful of people could have made things very different 15, 16, 18 months ago, whatever it was. And yes, the system held, yes, the institutions held, but we came so close, and it is so easy to see how it might have been different. And I think that is not a small thing. We've seen presidents who were crooks and corrupt and all of that. We've never seen a sitting president try to hold on to power, even though he knew or should have known that he lost at the ballot box. And then, of course, what we saw last week with Cassidy Hutchinson, knowingly send a mob that he understood had weapons to the Capitol to try to disrupt the counting of the vote. We have come to understand, we've come to almost normalize that in some way, as if that is not normal, even in the broad history of our country. And so I do think it came close, and I think that the fact that X% of the public doesn't see that as a problem is also a problem.
I'm not sure that we're numb to it, though, Peter, because I agree with everything you just said. I think our attention span is harder to keep, and we lose focus more easily. The Trump phenomenon as a news story was incredible because interest never abated. And we covered 9/11, and I mean, we didn't think we'd ever stop thinking or talking about that, and then all of a sudden it just stopped. Yeah. And it stopped because people just couldn't keep going there. And with Trump, they can, and again, I come back to media culpability in fostering this and cementing this division or the normalization of some of these things. We have to be able to say, this is just totally wrong and undemocratic and so dangerous for our country. And so the focus on what we have got to do about it is in part the role that the news media is doing, the role that the Congress is doing. This commission, in my judgment, has been remarkable because, commissions are not usually that great. Although I do still think the 9/11 Commission did an excellent job. I mean, you got to read it, you got to pay attention to it, you got to be engaged, right? That's the role. That's what's our job as citizens. What did Thomas Jefferson, he had a lot of faults, but he understood that we have to be informed, fully informed, not just following the stuff that makes us feel good about ourselves and makes us feel bad about that other person. It's that fully informed. And so protecting voting rights, that people everywhere can vote, and it should just be totally easy. That's the point. It should be really, really easy to vote, period. Who's against that? So work to make it so. We can volunteer our time. We can put our effort in there. I would say, I hate to say it, watch less cable. Spend more time getting people to vote, and we need to vote ourselves, and we need to be engaged ourselves. So we got to get to that piece of, none of us know how close we are to losing it all. But we got to be focused on, okay, well, where do we go from here? Because we've been through awful periods in this country. and we have come back from them. And you know what's bad? We then go back into them again. So that is some of the reality we have to live with.
You brought up Jefferson and his insistence that an informed electorate is fundamental to a democracy. How do we deal with a misinformed electorate?
Well, I mean, look, there's a long tradition of that too. Let's not. I think it's important not to over romanticize, that aspect of the past. And by the way, it is, completely true, right? What was it? Adlai Stevenson said, well, sir, all the thinking men are with you, and he said, yeah, but that's not a majority, I mean, look, I actually think David's point is an important one. There has been an enormous amount of terrific, important, illuminating, investigative journalism, as well as investigative congressing, that's happening with this commission. And let's remember that they've only selectively released a small part of the evidence. I personally am really looking forward to, they have said that they will release all of these 1,000 depositions that they've taken from witnesses. So the evidence we have is really still very fragmentary, and that's important to say. But in many ways, we're in a kind of a negative and dystopian moment. I think there was a survey last week that said something like 85% of Americans currently think the country is on the wrong track. So it's a very negative moment. And certainly around journalism, there's a lot to feel negative about the kind of public discourse and moment we're in. But it's also been a golden age in some ways of, for anyone who cares about information, ideas, access to people and stimulation, right? We tend to lose sight of that because we're in this sort of collective, angst-ridden crisis. But it's not because of a lack of accountability, journalism, or reporting that Donald Trump became president or that sustained him throughout. And, there's a level of disingenuousness as well, right? Even many of those who've broken with Trump, you'll hear them say things like, well, he really went crazy after the election. How many people here believe that? I mean, let's be honest, right, folks? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Donald Trump of January 20th, 2017 was the exact same guy of January 6th, 2021. So let's be real. When we hear from people who say, people who endorsed Donald Trump, including, by the way, our current hero of the moment, Liz Cheney, endorsed Donald Trump, not in 2016, in 2020. She endorsed him for re-election because if she wanted to be a politician in Wyoming, I think it's actually the most red state in the country in terms of the voting gap, right? It's actually not possible, really, to be a viable candidate there unless you were a partisan Republican. And I say that just because the information environment it's one contributing factor to our collective dysfunction, but it is also, it's not the reason in and of itself for the lack of ability and the system not functioning.
I just also want to underline this point about Liz Cheney, and we've said it a few times, and I just want to say it again because I think it's really important on the what do we do part of this, right? So as citizens, if we get comfortable with canceling people, I've had this debate with my daughter, who said, oh, well, Abraham Lincoln had the views of his contemporaries, so I'm done with him. Yeah. And I said, okay, well, here's the problem with that. If we don't have Lincoln, we may no longer have America, and we may not have those socks. So what I'm saying is, if we say Liz Cheney was for the Iraq War, was for enhanced interrogation, and therefore that's it with Liz Cheney, we lose a broader context of Liz Cheney. Now, there may be people who are reminded of her views and say, still don't like Liz Cheney, still don't think she should be in Congress, or they may have changed their views and cannot stop applauding the very idea of her. And again, that's where we can't just close down our minds. We need a little bit of perspective, which reminds me of one story I want to tell about Peter. So we were talking about Bush before. This is really just a cheap way to do a Bush impersonation. But so part of what is hard about living in the moment is making judgments about the moment and extrapolating forward is that we lack a little bit of context. So Peter's book called Days of Fire, right, about Bush-Cheney years, which I thought was the best book, bar none, go buy it today, about the Bush presidency. And Bush was very petulant about it. I went to go see him in Texas, and I'm like, Mr. President, I said, have you read Peter's book? I said, it is so great and so fair to you. He's like, yeah, I know. I've heard a lot of people tell me Peter's done a good job. He said, here's the problem. Peter was there. So he doesn't have the distance to write about my presidency. And I was just like, I said, please, can you stop with that? You know, we were all there, so therefore we can't have any judgments. He needs more time.
That's very good.
I'm going to move to another question. I'm paraphrasing here. What role is religion taking currently in shaping our current political climate? And what role do you think the church should play in our democracy? Yeah.
Peter likes all the controversial ones, so.
Yeah, everyone's looking to you, Peter. Go ahead.
I don't know. I don't have anything all that bright to say about it.
He does a good Bill Clinton impression.
I'll do Clinton, he'll do Bush. George, I thought that was a great statement. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll give you a chance to think, because certainly, again, in our history, there have been times when religion has been paramount. I mean, in the 50s, there was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that said, you know, we're a Christian nation and believe in Jesus Christ. Also, that period of Eisenhower and, who is it? Billy Graham. So this is, again, not brand new.
But I think it's a major explanation, actually, for part of what we're seeing, right? I mean, you were talking about the Supreme Court, of course. What is the context for the rift and the falling out and the reason that Mike Pence was Donald Trump's vice president in the first place? Absolutely. Probably, we talk a lot about the media. You know, we in the media believe that we should talk about ourselves at all times. So, of course, we're talking about the media. But, you know, the other major shift, arguably, right, since the 1970s in our politics has been the institutionalization and in some ways the institutional takeover of the Republican Party by a very committed, mobilized, and organized group of white evangelicals. And, you know, for many of them, the last week has been an incredible vindication of a theory of power politics and how it works in America. And, you know, it was always a very uncomfortable and awkward fit to see, and you know, we all saw it ourselves, right? You know, for 4 years, the kind of Mike Pence, Donald Trump, talk about the most awkward of arranged marriages. Clearly, these were folks who, you know, didn't really belong together in the same sense, and yet they made common cause with each other, right? And for, you had the number, what was it, 1,447 days, right? Mike Pence never did a thing in public to disagree with Donald Trump, in part because there was a sense that a long game was being played, that an achievement over time for this group of evangelical Christians would result in exactly what has happened over the last week. This was the payoff for a very unusual and in some ways very transactional decision and choice that was made. So for me, that's the context in which I would look at that question. But I think, you know, there's a bigger picture context as well that transcends this moment, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the religious piece, what you said, Susan, about organization, mobilization, really since, you know, probably the late 60s, you know, and the rise of Ronald Reagan in California, and then even though we had an evangelical Christian president in Jimmy Carter, the religious right as an organizational tool against the Equal Rights Amendment and then against the abortion decision So I think there's no question. And then we had aspects of time, even with, Bill Clinton, who as a Southerner and a religious person understood the power of religion in government and more in society and in mobilization. And we have, immigrants to this country too, who are deeply religious, who are responding to a lot of these arguments as well. And I just would say that while I think the issue of religion as a motivator on the court is certainly present. I don't think we should discount the point about power politics, the Federalist Society, and that movement against Roe v. Wade. I don't think we can discount the level of disagreement in the country about Roe v. Wade, and particularly in the legal community of this country, who felt as a matter of constitutional law that it was wrong then and didn't stop being wrong. They just didn't have the ability to overturn it. I think that's an element of that, and I think it's a little facile to just say, oh, it's just the religious, crazies who are getting rid of all this.
Yeah, I'm also concerned about the Kennedy decision. I wonder if that coach in Washington had been Muslim and was offering Muslim prayers out at the 50-yard line, what the reaction would have been. I'm going to move on to another question. Our time is getting pretty short. I'm going to put together a couple. I apologize. With my ethnic background, I want to move my hands around, and I realize now I'm taking the mic away from my face just about half the time I'm talking. So this one has to do, let's see how to put it. Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon to end what he called a great nightmare for our country. In your mind, what are the pros and cons of the possible indictment of Donald Trump?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because just today I wrote a piece in the paper about more about the legal aspects and effect of what we know and whether it's a prosecutable case. But you're right, any prosecution of a president or a former president takes on larger meaning than just can you meet the elements of a crime in a courtroom. Gerald Ford walked around for the rest of his life with a piece of paper in his wallet, and it was a copy of I'm going to get the date wrong, 1905, something like that, decision by the Supreme Court that said that those who accept a presidential pardon implicitly admit guilt. And he walked around and showed that to anybody who ever questioned his decision to pardon Nixon by saying, see, he's guilty because I pardoned him in that sense. It was his way of explaining why he did, and to say he was not just letting him off the hook. But there is this question of accountability versus looking like a banana republic, right? And how does that choice present itself to Merrick Garland and ultimately Joe Biden, should he choose to engage on it? Biden told us during the election he wasn't going to pardon Trump, and he wasn't going to, and he said since then he doesn't want to interfere in what the Justice Department is doing. But Merrick Garland is a very thoughtful, long-time judge who is not quick, obviously, to make sharp decisions. And I think he is thinking about these things. If you were going to get to the point where you were actually going to prosecute a former president, can you do it in a way that doesn't just simply open the door to the perception that all we do now is start going after our opponents when we get power, right? That may not be the substance of it, but is that the perception of it that changes the nature of how our political system works? And that's a huge issue, a huge issue. On the other hand, no man is above the law, no person is above the law, as we like to say. Should you be able to get away with things that, let's say, attorneys would declare to be criminal just because you were president? Obviously, that's not something that is desirable either. Impeachment, it was supposed to be the solution in some ways. They impeached Trump twice. It didn't stick. And therefore, you see a situation where former President Trump may announce within days, weeks, or months that he's going to run again for office, which might have the effect, and maybe that's part of the intent, to make it even harder to prosecute him for anything that happens, because then suddenly you're prosecuting somebody who wants to be president of the United States. So that's a huge conundrum. I don't take a position on it as a reporter, obviously, but we talk a lot about the elements of crime. I've written a lot about that. Has it been met? But there are these larger considerations which are really, really important and have long-term consequences. And what Gerald Ford thought was, better to pardon Nixon and move the country on. That's a calculation that would be very different today, I think.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't have much more to add except that it does seem to fall in the nature of a crime that is potentially so big, that is to say, not actually agreeing with the constitutional principle of a peaceful transfer of power, right? Essentially, that's what we're talking about here: the obstruction of Congress from carrying out its assigned role in the Constitution of certifying and ratifying the results of a presidential election. And it's the nature of a crime that potentially is so big, it begs the question of whether, right, some crimes are so big they can't be prosecuted and you can't be accountable for them. And I think, in many ways, this goes back to this very robust and for me, stimulating conversation we've had today about democracy, because it is actually ultimately about can our institutions still function in a system where it's not clear that we have public faith and trust in those institutions, and alternately where if they fail to provide accountability, should we have trust in institutions that can't deliver it? And so I just think it's a profound conversation we're having, and that's one that we do need to be having. I understand we'd rather just go. No, time's up. It's time to go to the beach and not have this conversation, and give you all leave to not think about Donald Trump for the rest of the day.
Would you like a last word?
No, I would leave the last word with them. That was lovely.
I want to thank you all for being part of this discussion this morning. My admiration for our community to spend their sunny 4th of July morning here having this conversation is immense. The health of our democracy ultimately depends upon the interest and efforts of its citizens. I think what we are doing here this morning is an important step in that realm. Our efforts to ensure a just government based upon the consent of the governed require our efforts to ensure a fair, nonpartisan election process, and it is our duty to inform our representatives of our belief, and most importantly, vote. I would like to thank the Dreamland and Indivisible Nantucket for sponsoring this event. I encourage you to support these organizations if you so choose. You can go to their websites. Beyond that, I wish you a very happy 4th of July.